Hi everyone, I'm Alli, and today we're going to be talking about crisis intervention theory. Let's start with a story. It's November 28, 1942. The Coconut Grove nightclub in Boston is in flames. There are hundreds of people packed into a glamorous but overcrowded venue. Within minutes, a fire spreads rapidly. Locked exits, locked doors, and flammable decorations turn the club into a death trap. Smoke fills the air and panic erupts. By the end of the night, 492 people are dead. The survivors are stumbling out into the cold streets in Boston. Some are burned, some are in shock. Grieving families are going to hospitals, waiting for news. In the weeks that followed, a psychiatrist named Eric Lindemann met with survivors and grieving families. He studied their acute grief reactions. They were having nightmares. They felt guilt. They felt physical distress. They felt emotionally dysregulated and disconnected. They couldn't cope. They were overwhelmed. What he recognized was that early psychological support could prevent longer-term trauma. And that led him to develop some of the fundamentals of what would become crisis therapy or crisis intervention theory. In 1944, he wrote a paper, Symptomology and Management of Acute Grief. And he talked about this idea that immediate intervention, helping survivors or anyone experiencing a crisis express emotions, process things, develop coping strategies, and get access to the resources they need, could reduce longer-term psychological damage. So that work laid the foundation for modern crisis intervention theory. It shaped the way emergency mental health services, trauma counseling, and crisis response teams provide today. For the rest of the podcast today, we're going to be talking more about what crisis intervention theory is and how it works and how it fits with social work practice. So more specifically, after this, we're going to do a brief introduction to what the theory is. We're going to talk about the descriptive theory, or what crisis intervention theory sees as the problem, then the prescriptive theory, which is crisis intervention theory's view of what would help. And finally, we'll talk about how it fits with social work practice. All right, so our quick intro to crisis intervention theory. So what is it? In short, crisis intervention theory is used anytime a crisis or any sort of precipitating event, or can be used when any sort of precipitating event disrupts someone's usual state of coping and functioning in the world in their daily lives. It's a very short-term and goal-oriented approach. The idea is that it can help individuals regain stability after a crisis and even grow in positive ways. It's intended to be ameliorative rather than curative, so it's not necessarily getting to the deepest root cause issues, but it is helping someone return to that baseline level of functioning. It emphasizes that immediate support, stabilization, problem solving, and again, the idea here is that it's good to help people return to baseline in the short term, but also that doing so can prevent even longer term, more extensive psychological harm. It's rooted in sort of this grief work from Lindemann that we just discussed coming out of the Coconut Grove fire, as well as preventative psychiatry. As it's evolved, it's begun to include, there's more structured models of ways to do it, and we'll talk about some of those, although there's a number of them. And it's currently really widely used across a number of mental health settings and emergency response, as well as in suicide prevention specifically. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about some of the contributors in the development of the theory. I won't get into all of these, but I do think it's helpful to just know sort of the history of it. So most sources put sort of the groundwork for it in that Coconut Grove fire and the work that Lindemann did following it. Gerald Kaplan is another sort of person who gets named as one of the other founders of the theory. And so his work, he's known for something called preventative psychiatry, which really emphasizes the importance of immediate or short-term assistance as a means to prevent longer-term harm and damage. And then, in the 1950s and 60s, the work of Schneidman, specifically around suicide prevention and suicidology. Crisis intervention theory and suicide prevention are not one and the same. But as crisis intervention theory, and when it was, the work of Lindemann and Kaplan didn't really get at suicide specifically. But as the field has evolved and as these models have been developed, they've been more and more utilized to address people in acute mental health crises as well, including people with suicidal ideation or behaviors. So it is good to sort of know that they are not the same, but that that they're quite interrelated. The work of Howard Parad, and we're going to talk later about what is a crisis, but his work really sort of set one of the most used definitions of crisis in the literature, which is crisis as a disruption of equilibrium. And then once we start looking at the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, that's where we see more and more these more specific models being built out of what crisis intervention looks like when it is applied. What are the steps? How do you do the steps? So those more applied models of what the theory looks like. All right, so descriptive theory of crisis intervention. What then is the problem? So to start then, we should talk about what is a crisis, how is it defined? And so there's a lot of literature on this, and different theorists and different authors have different takes on what a crisis is. But in short, people are in crisis when they're overwhelmed or they're not able to access the internal and external resources that they need to cope with a stressful event. So to some degree, this is subjective in that an event could happen and multiple people could experience the same event. And for some, it will be a crisis. It will knock them out of their state of equilibrium. They will not be able to cope. They will experience short-term harm. They could go on to experience longer-term harm, right? It's a crisis. For others, they could experience the same event and maybe they have some negative impact from it. Maybe they have some negative feelings from it, but they're able to cope. So it's important to keep in mind, I think, that there is something of a subjective nature to what is a crisis. But as much as we can define it, there's always some sort of precipitating stressful event or situation. And that situation, for it to be a crisis, it needs to be overwhelming and disrupt someone's usual state of homeostasis. Usually when that state of homeostasis is disrupted, you'll have some form of psychological distress. And of course, right, that can look a lot of different ways. For some people, it could be shock, fear, anxiety, anger, grief. And different people will respond to the same crisis differently, and they're humans coming at it with their own lives and experiences. And so for some people, their go-to response is anger. For some, it might be confusion. Some people might feel really helpless. There are some models of crisis intervention theory that we'll talk about later, but there are some models that in their definition of a crisis really focus on someone's perception of the crisis, and their thoughts about that as a cause of distress. That doesn't show up in all sort of definitions of a crisis, but I think it's important to name. Literature talks about someone's usual coping mechanisms failing, so that can lead to people feeling immobilized, and also there's also can be issues of real practical material resources, financial, access to other basic needs, and then as well as like emotional and social supports just may be exhausted. So there's short-term impacts, right? You can have emotional, behavioral, cognitive, physiological changes, and essentially those changes are leading to someone's overall functioning being impaired compared to how they were functioning before whatever that traumatic event or that crisis event was. The other thing that's important here, I think, is that after a crisis intervention theory sees that there's the potential for either maladaptive outcomes, so outcomes that are harmful and like not in line with what the person wants for their life, or for adaptive growth, so growing towards resiliency, new skills, new ways of coping, new social connections in the world. There's different types of crisis too. So that's basically, we just talked about what a crisis is, but you can probably imagine that you could apply those like qualities of a crisis to a lot of different types of crisis. So we'll just talk about some of them, and these are just examples. This is not exhaustive. But one category is like sudden or unexpected events. So like a car loss, losing a job, getting fired, being diagnosed with a chronic or serious illness, experiencing abuse or violence, being a victim of a crime. Um, those are all would fall under this like sudden, unexpected events. Especially for that last one, abuse, violence, and criminality. That just brings up, I think, an important point, which is that the basis of crisis theory primarily is around sort of acute one-time events like the Coconut Grove, like being a survivor of a nightclub fire. Um, However, there are certainly, and if we think of something like a natural disaster, that's not something likely that a person is likely to experience multiple times in sort of a chronic state. However, and some acts of violence are like that as well, being a victim of a random violent crime. On the other hand, we also know that a lot of people experience violence on a regular basis, maybe as domestic violence within their family unit. So it's more of a chronic state. So crisis can be more of a chronic situation. I think it's important to say that from what I understand of the literature, crisis intervention theory was primarily developed thinking about those more one-time and acute crisis situations. That doesn't mean the principles and the models can't be applied to more chronic, ongoing states, but I do just think that it's important to have that background. Okay. So then other types of crises that are described in the literature are life stage transitions or developmental transitions. So these are just things like they're parts of life, but for people, depending on their mental, emotional, social states, they may sort of trigger an internal crisis. So something like becoming a parent for the first time, a new marriage or divorce, grief and loss, aging, someone's retirement. These things can all trigger crises for people. There's also a category known as existential crisis. So people are really grappling with the meaning, purpose of life, identity to the point where it becomes overwhelming. There's also external systemic or environmental crises. So that's things like um, a community-wide disaster, living in a place where there's an active conflict happening, climate change disasters, pandemics, are living through a pandemic. That could certainly be one. And then the final category is psychiatric or mental health. So this is often someone experiencing suicidality, but it could also be someone experiencing an acute psychotic episode, major depressive episode, symptoms of bipolar disorder in an acute way, panic attack. And of course, these categories are not mutually exclusive, right? And sometimes I think it can be challenging to pick apart what type of crisis someone may be experiencing because they may be experiencing multiple of these crises at the same time, essentially. So what happens in a crisis? Let's walk through it. So we have the crisis, we have our event, and then the person experiencing it just feels overwhelmed. Their ability to cope, they're overwhelmed. Their usual resources are not cutting it. Next up is acute distress. So they are experiencing those psychological, physiological, behavioral changes. This leads to short-term impacts. Their functioning is lower than their usual baseline. And if there's no intervention, that impaired functioning can really lead to long-term impacts on their life. So what types of impacts of crisis when we talk about them? What are we talking about? Well, they're psychological and emotional. So that can include, like I said, feelings of loss, fear, shock, helplessness, disbelief, dysregulation, difficulty with grounding and stabilization. Cognitive impacts, so distorted negative cognitions about the self, including self-blame or worthlessness. People can experience just sort of difficulty making decisions or even getting their thoughts organized when usually they are quite organized in their thoughts. They can also experience intrusive thoughts or ruminations, similar to what you'd see in someone with a PTSD diagnosis. Behaviorally, they may be experiencing avoidance or withdrawal from usual activities. They may be engaging in maladaptive coping techniques or decrease in like their adaptive coping skills and disruptions in all of their daily functioning. And then depending on the type of crisis, there may also just be basic survival needs that need to be met. So people may be housing insecure, food insecure, they may have financial insecurity. Transportation could be a need, disruption to physical and mental health care. I'm not going to get into this too much, but Kaplan, who, as I mentioned, is one of the founders of the field, he developed this model sort of how a crisis moves, like what are the steps. And the things that I think are important to point out here is the last two steps. Each of them essentially has two ways it can go. So either someone after the crisis can essentially experience like a breakdown where their functioning just really is falling apart, or they can start to mobilize internal and external resources and support. And then the final step is crisis resolution. And what that means is that either they have negative long-term impacts or there's positive outcome and growth that come about as a result of the crisis. Let's talk about a quick case study. So we have a woman named Jessica. She's 32 years old and she has two children. One night, she's sexually assaulted by her husband, who's the father of her children. Although Jessica has a long history of sobriety, she begins drinking again. She isolates from her AA group, from her sponsor, her friends, from her church community. She really wants to talk about it and what happened, but she's afraid that if she does, the people who really care about her will tell her that she should leave, and she feels like she has no place to stay, and she's worried she'll lose custody of her children. She starts to struggle with fear. She feels confusion and anger about the assault. She starts having panic attacks, and she struggles with increasing feelings of anxiety and depression. She has a hard time getting out of bed in the morning, and she's actually fired from her job as a paraprofessional, which was a good job. She's worried that she isn't as present for her children anymore. She's really struggling with ongoing feelings of self-hatred. She begins to think that the assault and the impacts on her life are all her fault. Her drinking is increasing, and she actually even begins experiencing medical complications from alcohol. So in this case study, we have our event, the assault that Jessica experiences. We can see that her coping skills are overwhelmed. What she usually uses to cope, she's really good social safety nets and connections. Those are all of a sudden not working for her. She starts to feel this short-term acute distress, these really strong feelings that she has a hard time, doesn't have a safe place to bring them. We start to see how her functioning on a daily basis is really decreased. She's not getting out of bed. She's struggling with her job. She's struggling with parenting. And we can see how that could really easily have a negative long-term impact for Jessica. Okay, so with that in mind, what could help? What can we think of that could help? In short, if crisis is defined, in short, as people losing their equilibrium, then the goal of crisis intervention is to help restore them to an equilibrium. And the other thing that I know I've mentioned before, but I want to mention again, I think the concept of a crisis as a potential catalyst for growth after resolution is really important. So what would a crisis intervention look like? Well, it would need to address the immediate threat. It would need to increase feelings of safety, calm, hope. It would need to provide access to social supports. It would lead to feelings of empowerment and self-efficacy. It would provide concrete steps and resources towards reducing harm in the short term. And yeah, it would give people that opportunity to grow. So if someone were to have all of those things, what could happen in a crisis with intervention? So we've got our model that we already talked about. But let's see how that differs if there is intervention, a more immediate intervention. Instead, now we have a crisis. We have increased ability to cope and resilience because of the intervention. If you have increased ability to cope, then your distress will go down. If your distress is going down, you'll have a reduction in short-term symptoms. So your functioning will return to at least a baseline, and then there's less chance of long-term symptoms like PTSD. Okay, so hallmarks of crisis intervention include proximity. It's occurring like close in time and even like distance, like physical distance to whatever that crisis or precipitating event was. So we're not talking 20 years later. We're talking, there's no set time, but in the weeks or even months after, but not years. It's focused. So the interventions are primarily focused on the events and basic needs. It's directive and supportive. It's not necessarily doing a deep dive into, childhood experiences. Those may come up as they're relevant, certainly, but it's really keeping the focus, the base on that precipitating crisis event. And it's brief. The idea is to stabilize the client and to restore functioning as quickly as possible. That, of course, doesn't mean that it's the only therapy that can be, or intervention that can be provided for people who've experienced a crisis. But the theory goes that this longer term harm can be, that there's a better chance of avoiding that if people are restored to their baseline functioning as soon as possible. So really wanting to be brief and efficient about those initial steps of the process is really critical to the theory. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's at least different frameworks or models of what crisis intervention theory can look like. I have a list of them here on this little sticky note. Different authors and theorists have their own models. And they all are quite similar to each other. They're not, they're all different, but they have kind of looking through them. There's a number of key sort of components that they all have in common. So the first one is just looking for like immediate danger or lethality, essentially like life and death situations. This is especially important, obviously, in the context of an acute mental health episode, suicidology, but in any situation, really just wanting to make sure that people's like life and death needs are taken care of and understanding the person's mental status just from the beginning. If suicidality is relevant, if it's on the table, that would include looking for ideation, intent, and a plan. But again, suicide isn't always directly relevant, but certainly understanding someone's initial mental status and where they're at would be a really critical first step. Again, this is very brief. This is very, very brief. This isn't a whole session dedicated to this. This is just the first minute of an interaction. Then you would quickly moving into establishing a rapport, engaging, and this is very similar to a lot of humanistic, person-centered, client-centered approaches using body language, active listening, reflection, and so on. And again, this needs to happen quickly. So there's really no time to waste in sort of establishing the clinician and establishing the counselor as somebody who's trustworthy, who can be helpful, who's on the client side. The clinician should embody the words I read were like confidence and stability. Like, I'm here, I've got this, we've got this together. And right from the very beginning, the clinician can begin providing psychoeducation on crisis and trauma that might be helpful. Then it moves to, from that initial establishing rapport and engaging, trying to understand the presenting problem, immediate needs, and context. So this is essentially an assessment. And asking why now? What's happening now? Why is this person in crisis right now? And this is essentially happening alongside the establishing of rapport. Once that's been mapped out a bit, then there's a little bit more time and space for the client to express their feelings. The clinician can really elicit and the negative feelings, the confusing feelings and thoughts that the client might be experiencing, offering reflections, offering some reframing if that's helpful, offering validation, and really a strengths-based exploration. the client coming at it with non-judgment, giving the client a place to express any thoughts and feelings they have, even those that might not feel acceptable to express out in the world or with their friends and family or with other survivors. And in some cases, depending, some models really use approaches that are more like a CBT. Again, um, if there are some cognitive distortions happening, like someone feeling that they personally were to blame for an event that they clearly are not to blame for, it can be, or that experiencing an event, being the victim of an event, has changed their self-worth, that some approaches like CBT can be really helpful. And then for others who may have a really hard time accepting and staying present with the reality of how their life may have changed or what the situation is, sort of some strategies from ACT can be suggested. The next sort of step is developing a collaborative and realistic action plan. So this is identifying coping methods and partial solutions, baby steps, like what might work, what has worked, what could work. Taking the strengths-based approach to building on identified strengths and natural supports, and looking at a plan of short-term and long-term action steps. And then there's after that sort of action plan has been developed, there are likely to be some check-ins and follow-ups as the client sort of starts to take those steps to rebuild their life, to repair their functioning. The follow-up should be very predictable. This should really be something the client can count on. And then as that process starts to take place, if it's not working, if the client's getting stuck, if the action plan is no longer feeling right, that can be reevaluated and it can be sort of reassessed as needed. There's different models of crisis intervention as well. And again, a lot of these, I think, or most of them, have more in common than they have different. But I think it's helpful just to know the range of what's out there. So there's the equilibrium model. So that's based on the work of Kaplan. And again, this is really like the contribution of this was um, seeing crisis as a state of disequilibrium and therefore crisis intervention as a way to return people to equilibrium. There's the cognitive model, which again focuses on someone's perceptions of the crisis as the target. There's a psychosocial transition model, and I think this one is like very social work aligned. It sees that really just holds that an individual's response to a crisis is a product of their own, it's very individual. It's a product of their own biology, their own social influences, social environment. It really sees a person as like person and environment approach. Um, and so clinicians are looking both at the internal, so that may include things like cognitions and thoughts and beliefs and how the person's history influenced how they experience the crisis. But it's also looking outwards at the social world. It's looking at external factors and barriers and systemic issues and alternatives and steps. Um, so I think that's a nice fit with the social work field. There's something known as psychological first aid, which is just really focused on the most initial stabilization of individuals who've experienced a crisis. And it is about just in a calm, sort of compassionate way, meeting basic needs and ensuring like immediate safety. So that's the first aid model. And then there's the suicide specific interventions, which again have that initial focus on assessing for lethality. There's a lot of rapport building. There's some different clinical sort of components here around suicide specifically. There's literature on things like managing the clinician's countertransference, the role of the clinician in normalizing the topic, the way that the topic is discussed, really wanting to help the client slow things down, minimize a power struggle, um, as well as safety planning, ongoing safety planning. All right, so what does the research say? It's interesting. A lot of the research is looking, from what I can tell, a lot of the research is looking at very specific models and less at like the theory as a whole or application of theory as a whole. So it can be challenging to say, like, without getting, like, it's a lot of the research, and that makes sense. A lot of the research is on like more granular applications of specific models or frameworks. One study that gets cited quite a bit was a meta-analysis from 2006 a meta-analysis from 2006 that looked at a number of crisis intervention studies um, and wanted to understand uh, its impact on other psychiatric uh, conditions, so depression, PTSD, suicidality. And what they found, they had a few key findings I think that are really helpful. So they found that like the 4 to 12 session engagement length was like really a sweet spot for reducing traumatic symptoms. They found that there are some models that use like a single session crisis debriefing. And they found that that really was less effective than multi-session interventions. Um, they found that if you had at least 8 hours of crisis intervention over 1 to 3 months, like that was consistently effective as well, which matches with those 4 to 12 session engagements. Um, but then also they said clearly that more rigorous experimental studies are needed. So a lot of the studies that they were able to find in that meta-analysis had small sample sizes. They didn't have an experimental design. So certainly I think a place, even that was from 2006, but there hasn't been a whole lot published in the last 20 years. So I definitely think specifically, particularly outside of a few key areas. So there have been some studies on like crisis intervention training for like law enforcement officers where there's a lot of studies, but that's a really specific use case, and I don't think it speaks to the approach more broadly as it's applied in the clinical world. So another study, more recent, this was a Cochrane review. So looking at the Cochrane database, and they were looking at the use of crisis intervention models with people with severe mental health illnesses, and I believe they were looking specifically at people with psychosis or psychotic symptoms. And what they found was that, the findings weren't like a grand slam, I would say, but they did show some like moderate uh, benefit. So a slight reduction in hospital readmissions, some improvements in mental states at 3 months, some improvements in just overall well-being at 20 months, um, no improvements in quality of life at 6 months. Um, However, people did feel that it was like uh, clients and their families felt that it was effective, like they reported that it was effective and that they were satisfied with it. It's unclear the degree to which it's really cost effective, um, and they weren't able to establish that from the Cochrane review. And they also weren't able to establish any difference in death rates, on staff satisfaction, like the people who were applying the intervention, medication compliance, or relapse of symptoms. So let's revisit our case study of Jessica. So again, she's a 32-year-old woman. She's been sexually assaulted by her husband. She's feeling lost and confused, but she Googles, "I think my husband raped me. What should I do?" And she calls a crisis line. Social worker who answers the call refers her to a therapist who's trained in crisis intervention approaches. The therapist uses a psychosocial transitional crisis counseling approach with Jessica. So Jessica explores her internal distress, how she's feeling, what she's doing to cope, what it made her feel about herself, and external barriers, the fact that she's worried about losing her housing, that she's worried about custody, that she's worried about financial struggles if she were to separate, her feelings that the assault was her fault, that it is something that she did, that it makes her feel worthless and confused. They identify potential resources and supports in the community, and they also take stock of Jessica's existing strengths and supports. Jessica begins taking concrete steps. They identify together, like reaching out to her AA sponsor and understanding what her options for safe housing are if she did decide to leave. The counselor provides Jessica with some psychoeducation about assault, including assault that happens within the context of a marriage. So even though she still faces real and systemic barriers, those haven't gone away. Jessica feels more able to handle them in ways that won't be self-destructive. She begins talking to her counselor about wanting to go back to school so she can help victims of sexual assault as an advocate or a lawyer one day. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about how crisis intervention fits with social work. I think there are a lot of areas of alignment of crisis intervention theory and social work. Some of the alignments are that it's really strength-based. It really starts with, making sure that the strengths and resources that a person already has are taken into account. It really recognizes the importance of meeting someone's basic needs. So like using like a hierarchy of needs approach, um, looking first at life and death, like threats to, that are life and death, but also just someone's basic needs in terms of food, housing, security, physical safety. It takes a systems and person environment approach. So it recognizes that crises don't happen in isolation, and neither does healing. It encourages choice, agency, and autonomy. It recognizes the importance of helping clients connect with social supports, which is so important. I think it's structured but flexible in a nice way. And I think really that concept of post-crisis growth and resilience is also really well aligned with the social work field. Some differences are that I think crisis intervention isn't particularly well suited to address systemic contributing factors in the longer term, like stigma, oppression, unjust policies and laws. I think that in some high risk situations, so for example, in like the criminal justice systems, that can be really directive. So it's really about trying to get a particular outcome, um, which I think can run counter to some of social work's principles around autonomy. And then I think similarly, if it's not used really carefully within a framework of social justice and harm reduction, it can be used as a tool of social control. So again, like law enforcement settings, or other like using it to move people towards institutionalization in a way that may be coerced, for example. About the therapeutic relationship in crisis intervention. I think there's some things that are a little bit different from the way, from other ways of using the therapeutic relationship or in other like therapeutic modalities in the social work field. But I think there's a lot that is similar to other approaches. So I think the thing that probably stands out the most is the importance of establishing rapport quickly, just because of the quick timeline and like the really brief nature and the importance of getting someone help to return to baseline functioning as quickly as possible. Uh, I think so. That I think is something that is sort of unique. But I think the basic humanistic like rapport building and active listening skills, that's something that's certainly familiar to other approaches. I think it's not necessarily unique, but I think it's good to hold in mind this idea of the clinicians embodying like confidence, competence, care. The clinician is there to help, even more so than other approaches. It's really important that the clinician is able to embody that confidence and competence. And part of what they're able to do then is to provide some emotional holding. So client is quite likely feeling somewhat out of control. And so having a figure that they are able to put some faith in while they sort of regain their balance is really important. Clinicians modeling effective problem solving, helping think through different options, different supports, different pathways forward. That modeling is explicitly named as like a part of the therapeutic relationship in crisis intervention theory. And also just encouragement of self-efficacy at every step of the way. Every decision, every like step on the action plan should be coming from the client's own priorities and what they want for themselves. That helps them reestablish a sense of control in a situation they probably really haven't had a lot of control in. And then quickly we can talk about some other theories and approaches and their relationship to crisis intervention theory. I won't go through all of these because just in the interest of time, I think One that was surprising to me is the intersection with psychoanalytic theory. It seems very different on their faces. Um, but crisis intervention theory takes from psychoanalytic theory the idea that there's like a limited amount of sort of like psychic energy, and in a crisis that's really quickly depleted, and that's one of the things that leads to imbalance. So like it's in some like psychoanalytic writing on crisis intervention, they're talking about like limited ego strength that gets depleted. And so essentially then the crisis clinician sort of temporarily acting as the client's ego when the client just doesn't have any coping resources. And that may show up for the client looking sort of like helpless and confused. Um, Again, the cognitive behavioral theories, particularly for crisis intervention approaches that really see the perception of the event or perceptions about the self in relation to the event as like the root of that disequilibrium. Those cognitive behavioral approaches really come into play to helping target those cognitive distortions. um, I think like existential theory is interesting around good when you're talking. One of those categories of crises was like existential crises, sort of grappling with meaning of life. And there's components around existential theory on anxiety and suffering, driving, being drivers of personal growth. Those also show up in crisis intervention theory. Um, and also the emphasis on what is in the client's sort of locus of control, on what, therefore, where they do have choice and responsibility, again, in situations where they haven't had much control. Um, so I think those are the ones that I'd like to highlight, but I do think it's really interesting to consider this wide range of other theories and approaches that have that that are tied in some way to crisis intervention theory. Okay, so when do I think, so knowing all of this, what types of situations lend themselves well to crisis intervention theory? Certainly, like I do think disaster response, those like single incident crises, so natural disaster, acts of terrorism, medical and psychiatric emergencies. I think domestic violence and a sexual assault certainly can, particularly when they are in more of an acute situation than a chronic situation. So I think um, there are parts of crisis intervention where if a client is in a is like returning to a situation where the crisis is ongoing, so something like domestic violence or ongoing sexual assault, for example, like within the home, I would have concerns that the approach may not, like crisis intervention theory essentially assumes that the active part of the crisis is over. And so if what is really happening is that it's ongoing, I'm not sure that it would be the strongest approach. But that's something I think I need to learn more about. Um, but but certainly like a victim of essentially like a random crime, that's a one-time occurrence, I think it would be a really strong use case. So again, I think it's weaker in contexts where clients have less choice and control to start with, in addition to the crisis. So like law enforcement capacity, I think, particularly when they don't have adequate training. This is a really popular way that it's being used now, and the research seems really mixed on it. And there does seem to be a lot of evidence that like training hasn't been sufficient. And again, when root causes are systemic and chronic rather than like a more acute situation. How would I use this in my own practice? So currently I work in community crisis stabilization services, so this is really relevant to my current placement. I think that some of the things I've learned that will be like really immediately helpful are this focus on confidence and competence, particularly when I'm working like on a crisis on a hotline. Projecting that calm authority is really crucial in rapport building. And I think that, particularly on the phone, particularly with someone who's brand new, that isn't always um, that takes some conscious doing. And I think it's really helpful to consider how important it is for the client. And I think that will really help me build those skills. I like the importance of a prioritized needs assessment. I am curious to learn more about like how this approach is different for different types of crises. For example, a mental or psychiatric health crises versus something like, um, survivors of violence. Um, and then I think, there is so much emphasis on helping clients find and access resources. It really just leads to the question, what about when suitable resources just aren't available? Um, what then? And I'm sure that there is literature on that, but that's something I definitely want to learn more about. I'm interested in working in school social work in the future, so I think this is really applicable to school social work as well. So I think some of the ways that I could see this applying in elementary school settings would be short-term stabilization of children, um, working with parents, teachers, support staff to sort of do some training on basic crisis intervention principles. I think it's interesting to consider like how to adapt to different developmental and cognitive levels. Um, I think that it's also interesting to think about like, I think right now at this moment in history, there are some things that are happening in society that can be experienced as a collective or a group crisis. And so what would it look like to apply some of these principles to some of those um, things that are happening in the world? Um, yeah, and what would it also look like to use this, say, in a classroom setting? All right, so that's it for today. Got a list of references here for anyone who's interested. I hope this was helpful, and thank you for letting me share.